Good morning, class. This is ECON 353 macroeconomics class. Today is April 5th, Tuesday.
Thursday, the class will cover the second half of chapter 12, which is aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis. So here is the order of today's video clip. Number 1, shift in the aggregate demand curve to short-run aggregate supply curve. 3, the labor market. 4, long-run aggregate supply curve. 5, aggregate demand curve. And 6, economics animation of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. 8, aggregate supply. 9, economics animation of fiscal policy. Here is the first video clip.
Aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is generated when national income circulates between firms and households. Some income is withdrawn, including savings, taxes and imports. New income is generated through injections, including exports, government spending, and investment. Aggregate demand is the sum of consumer spending, investment, government and export spending, less imports. Aggregate demand is inversely related to the price level. This is explained through processes such as the wealth effect. As the price level falls, real incomes are inflated and purchasing power increases. Consumers are wealthier and spend more. The interest rate effect means that at a lower price level, liquidity rises, and saving is more likely to increase than interest rates fall. This stimulates investment, which is a key part of aggregate demand. And the exchange rate effect. This means that, as interest rates fall, real exchange rates are driven down as investors switch to other countries. Lower exchange rates. This stimulates exports and reduces imports, creating a net injection. Aggregate demand can increase for a number of reasons, including a fall in interest rates, direct taxes, unemployment, and imports. Also, a rise in wages, consumer confidence, public spending, and exports. Aggregate demand can decrease for a number of reasons, including increases in interest rates, direct taxes, unemployment and imports. Also, reductions in wages, consumer confidence, public spending, and exports.
Now let's move on and talk about aggregate demand. Ceteris paribus, the higher the price level, the smaller is the quantity of real GDP demanded. And this happens for two reasons. So the aggregate demand curve, the first reason why it's sloped downwards is because of something known as the wealth effect. When the price level rises but other things remain the same, real wealth, or the amount of money in the bank or bonds, shares, assets, etc., decreases, their value decreases. To compensate for this loss in real wealth, people increase saving and decrease substitution, so less real GDP is produced as the price level rises. The aggregate demand curve also slopes down because of a couple of substitution effects. When the price level rises, and other things remain constant, the interest rate rises. Higher interest rates decrease investment and consumption on big-ticket items that require large loans. This is an intertemporal substitution effect, and this substitution effect involves changing the time of purchase of capital and consumer goods. So why buy it now at a high interest rate if I can buy whatever good I'm looking for in the future for a lower interest rate? When the domestic price level rises, domestic goods are more expensive on the world market, and so exports decrease. So this is another substitution effect. When the price level rises, the quantity demanded of real GDP decreases, and when the price level falls, the quantity demanded of real GDP increases. A couple of things that change aggregate demand. First of which is expectations. An increase in expected future income will increase consumption and thus increase aggregate demand. An increase in the future inflation rate increases aggregate demand today because people choose to buy more today at relatively lower prices in comparison to the future where they'll have to pay more. An increase in expected future profits will increase the investment that firms plan to make today and thus increase aggregate demand. And if we take the opposite, for example, if the expected future income rises, then the exact opposite happens. Fiscal policy and monetary policy are also huge factors that contribute to changes in aggregate demand. Fiscal policy, which we'll get into a little bit more detail, we'll get into more detail into fiscal policy and monetary policy later on, but for now just know that fiscal policy is the government's attempt to influence the economy by setting and changing taxes, making transfer payments, and directly purchasing goods and services. Tax cuts or increase in transfer payments will increase aggregate demand as both of those affect a household's disposable income. Disposable income is just the aggregate income minus taxes plus transfer payments. The greater the disposable income of a household, the greater that household's consumption is, and therefore there will be a change in aggregate demand. Government expenditure on goods and services will generally increase aggregate demand if they choose to increase expenditure, and decrease aggregate demand if the government chooses to decrease its expenditure. Monetary policy, for now, we're just going to define it like this, is the central bank's attempt to influence the economy by changing interest rates and the quantity of money. An increase in the quantity of money will increase aggregate demand, which will lower interest rates and make it easier to get a loan. Sorry, that's why aggregate demand shifts. Because interest rates are lower, it's easier to get a loan, so investment increases. We also have the world economy. In terms of the exchange rate, the amount of foreign currency that you can buy with domestic currency, that is the exchange rate. A rise in the exchange rate decreases aggregate demand because exports become more expensive and imports become less expensive. So we have exports minus imports decreasing, and so our aggregate demand decreases. An increase in foreign income will also increase domestic exports, and so domestic aggregate demand will increase. In essence, anything that changes real GDP, or CIGX minus M, consumption, investment, government expenditure, net exports, will shift aggregate demand, and usually you can use logic to figure out which way aggregate demand is shifting.
Remember the three macroeconomic goals: price stability, low unemployment, and high and sustained economic growth? Is there a tool that we can use to allow us to understand how price level, P, unemployment, U, and real GDP, or quantity of goods and services, Q, are determined? Well, we already have a tool, sort of. We'll just need to adapt it. It's the market tool, the supply and demand diagram. Think about it. The supply and demand in a particular market determine the price and quantity in that market. The issue is that the supply and demand in a particular market help me define the price of one product, not the price level of all products, and the quantity of one product, not the quantity of all goods and services, also known as GDP. The single market supply and demand diagram is actually pretty simple to modify into a macroeconomic model. Instead of looking at the demand for one product or service, we look at the aggregate demand for all products and services. And rather than the supply of a single commodity or service, let's use the aggregate supply of all commodities and services. Then, the equilibrium will represent the macroeconomic equilibrium. Rather than the equilibrium price of a single product or service, it yields the equilibrium price level of the prices for all goods and services. And instead of the equilibrium quantity of a single commodity, the equilibrium quantity of all goods and services, i.e. the real GDP, is yielded. So let's take a closer look at our modified market model, starting with the aggregate demand. Whereas demand for a single product is a collection of all the quantities demanded for that product at various prices and exhibiting an inverse relationship, the aggregate demand for all goods and services is an inverse relationship between the price level in the economy and the quantity of all goods and services demanded, or a collection of all the aggregate quantities demanded for all goods and services at various price levels in the economy. Why is there an inverse relationship? That is, why are fewer goods and services demanded when price levels are higher? Well, for a number of reasons really. If the overall price level for all goods and services is increasing, other things remaining equal, the existing income cannot buy as much as it used to. Another reason is that as the domestic price level rises, foreign goods start to look much more attractive. Households, businesses, and the foreign sector shy away from buying our more expensive goods. Also, higher prices tend to drive interest rates up. More on that later when we discuss credit markets. But that also depresses the amount of goods and services that the four sectors can buy or want to buy. Just like demand for a single product, a change in the price level will not shift aggregate demand, but only cause a movement along it. Is there anything that can shift aggregate demand? Sure. At a given price level, anything that changes total expenditures will change the overall aggregate demand. Do you remember who makes expenditures on goods and services? The household sector, the business sector, the government sector, and the foreign sector. This means that anything other than the price level that affects household consumption, C, business investment, I, government spending, G, or net exports, X, will shift aggregate demand. For example, in the 1990s, the U.S. stock market really boomed, and many households found themselves, as the market climbed, with increased wealth. This led to increased spending or a rightward shift of aggregate demand. Time to think. For discussion in our next class, what kinds of things other than prices could cause a change in 1. Consumption, 2. Investment, 3. Government spending, or 4. Net exports? Now, what about aggregate supply? The aggregate supply is the direct relationship between the price level in the economy and the aggregate quantity of goods and services supplied. The aggregate supply curve, then, is just a collection of all price level, aggregate quantity supplied combinations. Why is aggregate supply upward sloping? Well, for pretty much the same reasons that a single product supply curve is upward sloping: cost and profit. As the price level rises in an economy, other things staying the same, more producers, even inefficient, high-cost producers, can produce and survive. At lower price levels, only the lowest cost producers can continue. On the profit side, at higher price levels, other things staying the same, profits are higher, giving greater incentive to produce. Time to think. For our next class, what could shift aggregate supply? Again, changes in price level will only cause a movement along aggregate supply. What types of changes could occur that would have a broad effect on all types of production throughout the economy? Where aggregate demand and aggregate supply meet, we find our macroeconomic equilibrium: the price level, the quantity of goods and services, or GDP, and even an implied unemployment level. More GDP means more jobs and lower unemployment. Lower GDP means fewer jobs and higher unemployment. How will changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply affect prices, GDP, and unemployment? Next time, does the economy self-adjust?
In today's video, we're going to be introducing the concept of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is a macroeconomic concept, and it is the first part of a two-part model that is used to illustrate several macroeconomic factors. First, let's define aggregate demand and look how it is graphed on a basic diagram. Aggregate demand is simply defined as the total demand for a nation's goods and services in a particular period of time at a range of price levels. The aggregate demand curve can be plotted on an axis with average price level on the vertical axis and real GDP, or gross domestic product, on the horizontal axis. Real GDP, the abbreviation we will use, is a capital Y, which is short for national income. Average price level, we will use a PL. AD is a downward sloping curve showing an inverse relationship between the average price level of a nation's goods and services and the level of real output demanded at a range of prices. It's similar to a demand curve in that at higher price levels, a lower quantity of national output, or real GDP, is demanded. As you can see here, at a higher price level of PL1, only Y1 output will be demanded. But as the price level of a nation's goods and services falls to PL2, the quantity demanded will increase to Y2. There are 4 components of a nation's aggregate demand. These each represent different stakeholders or consumers of a nation's output. We have households who demand goods and services for consumption. Household consumption, the abbreviation we will use is a capital C. In addition to households, there are firms who demand capital goods in which they invest. The short abbreviation for firm spending on capital goods is capital I for investment. Next we have the government sector. Government, which spends on public goods and services, including education, infrastructure, healthcare for the nation's people. All of these different types of government spending, we use the capital G for an abbreviation for government spending. Finally, we have the foreign sector. Foreign spending on a nation's goods and services are known as exports. Of course, if foreigners buy a nation's goods, this counts as a positive towards the nation's aggregate demand and its GDP. However, if domestic consumers buy foreign goods, we must subtract the spending spent on foreign goods, and this of course is called imports, in order to come up with net exports. So export income from abroad minus expenditures on imports from abroad. This gives us net exports, or XN. A change in any of these 4 types of expenditures will lead to a shift in the nation's aggregate demand curve and an increase in aggregate demand, or a decrease in aggregate demand, depending on whether the type of expenditure either increased or decreased. The sum of consumption, investment by firms, government spending, and net exports gives us the total aggregate demand, or the total demand for a nation's goods and services in a particular period of time at a range of price levels. We know that if any of the components of aggregate demand change, that aggregate demand will either increase or decrease. But this raises the question of what can cause a change in one of the components of aggregate demand. We're going to go through each of the components of AD now and talk about some of the factors that can lead to either an increase in aggregate demand or a decrease in aggregate demand. First, let's talk about household consumption, which, as you recall, refers to the spending by domestic households on goods and services. The following factors can lead to a change in the level of household consumption in a nation. The first is the level of household income. If household incomes rise due to an increase in the wage rate in a nation or an increase in the demand for labor in a nation, household income will increase, and therefore the level of consumption will increase. An increase in consumption will lead to a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right, as we see here, to AD1. This could be caused by an increase in household income, which causes consumption to increase. However, if household incomes fall, consumption will decrease, and AD will shift to the left to AD2. This could be caused by a decrease in consumption. The level of household income is not the only determinant of consumption. In addition, household wealth is a determinant of consumption. Now this raises the question, what is the difference between household income and household wealth? Household wealth refers to the value of a household's assets minus its liabilities. Of course, this has nothing to do with the wages earned by a household. Household wealth refers to the value of assets such as stock portfolios, the holdings of government bonds by a household, or perhaps the value of a household's real estate or other investments not related to the household's income. Of course, this helps explain why something like a stock market bubble can lead to an increase in the aggregate demand in a nation. Even though household incomes might not be changing, if the value of the stocks held by households rise, households will feel more confident and consume in higher quantities. On the other hand, if there's a collapse of the stock market or a collapse in real estate prices, household wealth will fall, households will feel poor, and they will consume less, and aggregate demand will decrease. The third determinant of aggregate demand is real interest rates. Of course, interest refers to the return that a household can receive on saving money. Therefore, at higher interest rates, there's a greater incentive to save and less incentive to consume. At lower interest rates, however, households will prefer to borrow money and consume big-ticket items like cars or make new improvements on their homes, which require borrowing. At lower interest rates, households will save less, borrow more, and therefore consumption will increase. Thirdly, we have household debt. Of course, debt refers to the amount of money that households owe from previous consumption. This could be credit card debt or student loan debt, or maybe even debt from mortgages or loans that they received to buy a house. At high debt levels, households must allocate more income to paying off debts. Therefore, consumption falls. If households have high levels of debt, there will be a lower level of consumption and aggregate demand will decrease. Finally, the final determinant of consumption is household confidence. This is pretty straightforward. If households are confident about future incomes or employment opportunities, they are likely to spend more. So consumption will increase. On the other hand, if household confidence is low, and if they're not very confident about future opportunities or future income levels, then household consumption will be lower and aggregate demand will decrease. These are the various determinants of consumption: level of household income, the level of wealth experienced by households, real interest rates, which determines whether households will wish to save more or consume more, the level of household debt. Of course, at high levels of debt, households have less disposable income with which to consume. If household debt is low, then households will have more consumable income, allowing aggregate demand to grow. And the level of confidence experienced by households. If households are confident about the future, they'll consume more now and aggregate demand will increase. If confidence is low, household consumption will be lower. These are the determinants of consumption, and therefore each of these factors can lead to a change in aggregate demand. The second type of private spending that contributes to the level of aggregate demand in a nation is investment. Of course, investment refers to the spending by firms on capital equipment. The factors that can affect domestic investment include, most importantly, again, the real interest rates. Real interest rates are not only the return that savers receive for saving money, they also represent the cost of borrowing money. At lower interest rates, firms will borrow more money and buy new capital equipment. This allows firms to demand more capital equipment and therefore employ more workers and contributes to the overall level of economic activity in a nation. Of course, if interest rates are higher, the borrowing costs are greater, so firms will invest less. So the level of real interest rates determines the level of investment in the economy. Of course, just like households, firms are subject to their own level of confidence. So the expectations of firms, which affects the confidence they feel, affects the level of investment in the economy. If firms are confident about future business opportunities or their future levels of sales, this will lead to higher investment now and a greater level of aggregate demand. If expectations are poor about future business or sales opportunities, firms will invest less now and therefore less aggregate demand. Anything that causes investment in an economy to increase will lead to an increase in aggregate demand and a shift to the right of the AD curve. However, if investment decreases in an economy, AD will shift to the left and there will be less overall aggregate demand. The primary determinants of investment in an economy are the level of real interest rate and the expectations of firms about future business opportunities. Next, let's consider the level of government spending in an economy and discuss some of the things that lead to an increase or a decrease in government spending and therefore affect aggregate demand. Government spending is determined by a government's fiscal policy. This refers to the level of taxation and government spending. Anything that increases the level of government spending will shift aggregate demand to the right. Anything that decreases the level of government spending will shift aggregate demand to the left. Therefore, graphically, we can see that a fiscal policy that either lowers taxes or increases government spending will shift AD to the right. Why do lower taxes lead to an increase in aggregate demand? This is because households' disposable income will rise, businesses' disposable income will rise, and therefore consumption and investment will rise. Direct government spending contributes to the level of aggregate demand for a nation's goods as well. So higher government spending or lower taxes will shift AD to the right. If a government goes into debt, this could increase aggregate demand in the short run. But just like household debt, if a government has too much debt over time, it will begin to have to pay off that debt, and therefore taxes will have to be raised, and the level of government spending will have to decrease. Therefore, government debt is another determinant of government spending and therefore aggregate demand. The final component of aggregate demand is net exports. This, of course, refers to exports, which we use an X for, minus imports in a nation. The main determinants of net exports have to do with, of course, the incomes of foreign consumers. If foreign incomes rise, exports from a particular nation will increase and net exports will increase. Basically, exports refers to the output produced in a nation but consumed by foreigners. On the other hand, if the incomes of domestic consumers rise, then it might be expected that net exports will actually decrease. This has to do with the fact that as domestic incomes rise, domestic consumers will buy more foreign goods, therefore imports will increase and net exports will decrease. On the other hand, as domestic incomes rise, domestic consumer spending increases as well. So whether or not higher domestic incomes leads to an increase in aggregate demand or a decrease in aggregate demand depends on how much domestic consumption changes relative to the consumption of imported goods. The next determinant of net exports is exchange rates. Of course, foreign consumers must exchange their currency for the domestic currency in order to buy our exports. If our exchange rate rises or our currency gets stronger, our exports will appear more expensive to foreigners. Therefore, export income will fall and net exports will fall. On the other hand, if the domestic currency gets weaker, this country's exports will appear cheaper to foreigners, therefore net exports will rise since foreigners will be likely to buy more of the country's exports due to the weaker currency. The three determinants of net exports are income of foreign consumers, the incomes of domestic consumers, and the exchange rate of the nation's currency. If any of these factors change, exports can change, and therefore the level of aggregate demand in the economy can change. In the next video lecture, we will look at aggregate supply. We will add it to our model and we'll see how the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium level of real GDP is determined in a nation by comparing aggregate.
In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the most important part of macroeconomics. We're going to be looking at aggregate supply and aggregate demand. A couple of things that we're going to look at are aggregate supply, obviously, and obviously aggregate demand. But we're also going to be taking a look at some macroeconomic trends that have been found in the past couple of years and a couple of schools of thought, because not everybody agrees on the principles of macroeconomics when it comes to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Let's start by taking a look at aggregate supply. The quantity of real GDP supplied is the total quantity of goods and services valued in constant base year dollars. that firms plan to produce in a given period. Constant base year dollars means that we're looking at real GDP and not nominal GDP. The quantity depends on the quantity of labor, physical capital, human capital, and technology. But capital and technology are said to be fixed at any given time. The labor market can only ever be in three states. We can be at full employment, which means that the quantity of real GDP supplied equals the potential GDP. Below full employment, where the quantity of real GDP supplied is below potential GDP, and above full employment, where the quantity of real GDP supplied is above potential GDP. Aggregate supply is the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level. And everything that I've just mentioned in terms of the labor market, we'll see how that checks out on a graph a little bit later in the lecture. But basically, the point of this slide is to show you that when we look at aggregate supply and aggregate demand, we're going to be comparing the price level on the y-axis with real GDP on the x-axis. The long-run aggregate supply is the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level when the money wage rate changes at the same pace as the price level to maintain full employment. The quantity of real GDP supplied is equal to the potential GDP, and that is equal to the level of full employment. This quantity is the same regardless of the price level, which you can see because the curve is a vertical line. Long-run aggregate supply is vertical because as the general price level increases, the prices of factors of production will as well in the long run. They will increase as well in the long run. So real GDP does not really change with the increase in the price level. Short-run aggregate supply, on the other hand, is the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level when the money wage rate, the price of other resources, and the potential GDP remain constant. In the short run, a rise in the price level does bring an increase in the quantity of real GDP supplied, and that's why short-run aggregate supply slopes upwards. The real wage rate is at equilibrium where short-run aggregate supply intersects long-run aggregate supply, as we can see on the graph. An increase in potential GDP will bring about an equivalent increase in the short-run aggregate supply, and for our purposes, we're going to be assuming that the full employment price level remains the same. Potential GDP might increase due to an increase in the full employment quantity of labor. Potential GDP also increases if the quantity of capital increases, and this includes human capital as well. We can have advances in technology that also increase potential GDP because technology enables firms to produce more quantity of goods and services from any given amount of factors of production. It's considered the most important source of increased production. Short-run aggregate supply will also change in response to a change in the money wage rate. When the money wage rate changes, or any other factor of production, for example, cost of oil or raw materials, if that changes, the long-run aggregate supply remains unchanged. That curve does not shift. An increase in the money wage rate, for example, shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. This increase in firms' costs, and so the quantity supplied at each price level will decrease for all firms. Unemployment above the natural rate puts downward pressure on the money wage rate, and below the natural rate puts upward pressure on the money wage rate. An expected rise in inflation makes the money wage rate rise faster, and an expected fall in the inflation rate slows down the rate at which money wage rate rises.
I have a quick review question for you. Which economists believe that the economy is not self-regulating, classical or Keynesian? Keynesian economists believe that the economy will not self-adjust. Remember that this model arose from the evidence of the Great Depression when the global economy was in decline for an extended period. Because Keynesians do not believe that economic problems are going to take care of themselves, they conclude that the government should play a very active role in the economy. What kind of role? There are actually different tools that can be used to manage the economy, but let's start with fiscal policy. First of all, what is fiscal policy? By definition, fiscal policy is changes in government expenditures and taxation to achieve particular macroeconomic goals, that is, to achieve stable prices, low unemployment, and high and sustained growth. In a country like the United States, who is it that controls government spending and taxation? It's going to be our legislative and executive branches. Fiscal policy can be used to stimulate a sluggish economy or to slow down an economy that's moving too fast. Expansionary fiscal policy is typically represented by stimulus to the aggregate demand, although it certainly is possible to stimulate aggregate supply. Aggregate demand can be increased by either increasing government spending or decreasing taxes. Since aggregate demand is composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, an increase in government spending has a direct, immediate effect on aggregate demand. A tax cut, which will encourage spending on the part of households and businesses, has an indirect effect on aggregate demand as consumption and investment rise. Contractionary fiscal policy is typically represented by some type of drag on the aggregate demand, either decreasing government spending or increasing taxes. Again, a change in government spending will have a direct effect on aggregate demand, whereas a change in taxes will indirectly affect aggregate demand by way of households and businesses. Time to think. If you were a politician, which type of policy, expansionary or contractionary, would you like better? Well, if I were a politician and my primary objective was to get reelected to office, I'd want the policy that's more popular with the voters. After all, what will the voters like better? Tax cuts and more spending on their favorite programs, that is, expansionary policy, or higher taxes and cuts to their favorite programs, contractionary policy? Well, as a politician, I would prefer expansionary policy because voters prefer expansionary policy. The problem, though, is the effect that such a policy has on the nation's deficit and, in turn, its debt. The deficit is how much overspending there is in a single year. The debt is the accumulation of all the deficits we've ever run. Expansionary fiscal policy, lower taxes and/or higher government spending, adds to our deficit and, in turn, our debt. When we get to taxes and budget in episode 28, we'll look at interest payments on the debt. Yes, for the government to engage in deficit spending, it must borrow, just like you do when you spend more money than you have, and then it has to pay back the loan with interest. And we'll look at the subsequent drag on the economy. So, expansionary fiscal policy, lower taxes and/or higher spending, will increase aggregate demand. Contractionary policy, higher taxes and/or lower government spending, will decrease aggregate demand. If fiscal policy is meant to address the three macroeconomic goals, when is each type of policy appropriate? Well, if there's a recessionary gap where the equilibrium GDP is lower than our potential, which also means that unemployment is higher than the natural rate, expansionary policy would be the appropriate response. As aggregate demand increases, the economy moves to full employment and potential GDP. If there's an inflationary gap where equilibrium GDP is higher than full employment level and unemployment is so low that it's likely to cause inflation, contractionary policy would be the appropriate response. As aggregate demand falls, the economy slows, bringing us back to potential output, the full employment level. A classical economist would probably ask, why not just wait for aggregate supply to move and allow it to correct the economy? If you do not believe that the economy will self-adjust, or even if you think that it may self-adjust but only over a very long time, then you probably prefer a more active, hands-on policy to help things along. Next time, should we use fiscal policy?
We defined aggregate demand and compared the macroeconomic concept of AD to the microeconomic concept of demand. In this video, we're going to distinguish between a movement along a country's aggregate demand curve and a shift in the country's aggregate demand curve. Let's start by examining the factors that explain why the AD curve slopes downwards. In other words, why, when the price level falls, is there a movement along the AD curve, but not a shift in AD? So I'm going to put two price levels on here. We'll call it PL1 and PL2. Imagine there is deflation in the economy. The price of goods and services in the country decreases. That's falling prices. Falling prices. And as a result, the quantity of real output demanded by all the different stakeholders demanding American goods and services increases. So we move from point A to point B along our aggregate demand curve. So what are the reasons why there will be a greater quantity of output demanded at lower price levels and a smaller quantity of output demanded at higher price levels. There are three explanations for this phenomenon. The first is what we call the wealth effect. The wealth effect says that as the average price level of goods and services in a country falls, people's real wealth increases. In other words, the value of their assets increases. As people feel wealthier, they tend to demand a greater quantity of goods and services. It works in reverse as well. If the average prices of goods and services are rising, people feel poorer. Even if their incomes stay the same, they're going to feel poorer because the purchasing power of their wealth, or how many goods and services a particular amount of money can buy, decreases. Therefore, households reduce the quantity of goods that they buy. The second explanation for the inverse relationship between the price level and the quantity of real output demanded is what's called the real interest rate effect. This has to do with how banks respond to changing prices. If the price level in the economy is rising, banks, which make loans to households and firms for consumption of durable goods and to purchase capital equipment, banks will respond to rising prices by raising the interest rate they charge their borrowers. Of course, banks are looking out for their own self-interest. So as prices rise, banks have to compensate for the higher prices in the future by expecting a higher rate of return on the money that they loan out to borrowers. As banks raise their interest rates in response to rising prices, households and firms will respond by demanding a smaller amount of money from banks in order to buy goods and in order to buy capital equipment. If the average price level is falling in the economy, banks will lower the interest rate in order to encourage more borrowing, and as they do so, there will be a greater quantity of consumption and investment by households and a greater quantity of real output demanded. Finally, we have what's called the net export effect. This explains how foreigners will respond to changing price levels in the home economy. If there is inflation or higher inflation in a country's economy, we would expect foreigners to demand less of that country's goods and services because they are more expensive than goods produced in other countries or produced in the other country that is considering buying American goods in this case. On the other hand, if the domestic price level falls, foreigners will demand more of the country's goods. At the same time, domestic consumers will demand more American goods. Therefore, the quantity of real output demanded will increase. The wealth effect, the real interest rate effect, and the net export effect explain why aggregate demand is downward sloping. They explain why we would move from point A to B when price levels fall in the United States economy and move from point B to A when price levels rise in the American economy. Households will feel wealthier when prices fall, interest rates will decrease when prices fall, and foreigners will demand more American exports when prices in America fall. The reverse happens when prices rise. Households will feel poorer when prices rise, interest rates will increase when prices rise, and foreigners will demand less American goods when prices rise. Therefore, there is a greater quantity of real output demanded when prices fall, and a smaller quantity of real output demanded when prices rise. Next, we want to talk about factors that can cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve. What could cause total demand for United States goods and services to decrease from AD to AD1? And what could cause total demand for American goods and services to increase from AD to AD2? Well, this has to do with the components of aggregate demand that were introduced in the previous video. Just like in microeconomics, when we learned that a change in the price of a good causes a movement along the goods demand curve, whereas a change in one of the determinants of demand causes a shift in the goods demand curve, this same applies in macroeconomics. In macroeconomics, a change in the price level, as we showed over here, causes a movement along the AD curve, but a change in one of the components of aggregate demand will cause a shift in the country's aggregate demand curve. So for example, if consumption increases, this would cause a move from AD to AD2. So if households consume more, even if there's no change in the price level, then there will be an increase in aggregate demand from AD to AD2. However, if households consume less, there will be a move from AD to AD1. So what could cause consumption to change? Factors that affect the level of household consumption include changes in the rate of taxation, changes in consumer feelings or consumer confidence, changes in the level of income or the level of employment among households in the country. These are factors that can cause aggregate demand to increase or aggregate demand to decrease. In other words, shift outwards to AD2 or shift inwards to AD1. Let's talk about investment. Of course, the same thing is going to apply for investment. If there is an increase in investment in the country, if businesses buy more capital at every price level, then AD will increase to AD2. If there is a decrease in investment, in other words, the purchase of capital, equipment, and technology by businesses, then AD will decrease from AD to AD1. Some of the same factors that can cause a change in consumption can also cause a change in investment. If businesses are feeling more optimistic about the future, if there's expected inflation, if they think the prices of the goods that they're going to sell are going to increase in the future, they're going to want to invest more in the production of those goods now. If there is the expectation of lower prices in the future, or if business confidence is low, then businesses are going to invest less now and AD will decrease. If interest rates change, aggregate demand will change. If interest rates increase, businesses will find it less profitable to invest in capital equipment now, therefore investment will fall and AD will decrease from AD to AD1. If interest rates decrease, businesses will find it more profitable to invest in capital equipment now, and aggregate demand will increase to AD2. The next component of aggregate demand that can cause a shift in the AD curve is government spending, or this is T for taxes. If taxes decrease, so I'll say if taxes decrease, we're going to expect to see an increase in consumption and investment because businesses and households will want to spend more, and this would cause an aggregate demand to shift outwards. If taxes increase, the opposite will happen. If government raises the tax rate, we'd expect to see consumption to fall and investment to fall, causing aggregate demand to decrease. Government spending has a direct effect on aggregate demand. If government spending increases, let's say the government invests more in military technology or infrastructure, this will cause aggregate demand to increase. If government spending decreases, we would see a decrease in aggregate demand and a shift to the left of the curve itself. Finally, we have changes in XN, which is net exports. This measures the amount spent on exports by foreigners on a country's goods minus the amount spent on imports by domestic consumers of a country's goods. So if there is an increase in exports, ceteris paribus, assuming all else is held constant, aggregate demand will increase. If there is a decrease in exports, all else equal, aggregate demand will decrease. Now we could also isolate imports. If there is an increase in imports, if a nation's households spend more on imported goods, then all else equal, aggregate demand will decrease. This is a leakage from the country's economy. Buying imports stimulates a foreign country's economy, not the domestic economy. So there's less spending on domestic goods when there is more spending on foreign goods. If import spending decreases, ceteris paribus, all else equal, aggregate demand will increase because we assume that the nation's households are buying more domestically produced goods if they're buying fewer imports. So some of the factors that can cause changes in exports and imports, this has to do with factors like exchange rates. That's the value of a currency in terms of another currency. If the exchange rate falls, a country's goods become cheaper to foreigners, therefore exports would increase and imports would decrease. This could also be impacted by foreign incomes. If foreign incomes are rising, then U.S. goods will become more attractive to foreigners and net exports will increase in the United States. On the other hand, if foreign incomes are falling, then U.S. goods would become less attractive and aggregate demand would decrease in the United States. So to summarize, we've got the factors that can shift AD out. This could be an increase in consumption, an increase in investment by businesses, an increase in government spending, or a decrease in taxes, and an increase in exports or a decrease in imports. The factors that can cause aggregate demand to decrease include a decrease in consumption, a decrease in investment, a decrease in government spending, or an increase in taxes, and a decrease in exports or an increase in imports. So in this video, we've distinguished between what can cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve from point A to point B. That's a change in the price level, which is explained by the three effects: the wealth effect, the real interest rate effect, and the net export effect. Then we moved on to the factors that can shift aggregate demand. Shifts in aggregate demand are caused by changes in consumption, investment, government spending.
The aggregate demand, aggregate supply model or ADAS model for short, is the essential tool to model the macroeconomy at A level. There are two ways the ADAS model can be constructed. Firstly, the levels version, which analyzes how the economy's planned spending and planned supply are related to the economy's price level, the average level of prices as measured by an index, such as the CPI or the GDP deflator. The second version looks at the rates of growth in output associated with different rates of inflation, expressed as percentages. This version is more complex and is not generally used at A level. An economy's aggregate demand, or AD, is comprised of private sector spending, of which consumer spending is the largest component, spending by firms on capital goods, called investment, government spending on public goods, merit goods, and transfers, plus net export spending, which is overseas spending on an economy's exports less spending on imports. From this, we derive the AD equation, which is AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. In this simple example, we can see how the components of AD will respond to different hypothetical price levels. The model starts by assuming the quantity of money is constant and nominal wages are fixed. All other variables other than the price level are also assumed to be constant. So, at a price level index of 100 in our example, consumer spending is 85 billion, of which investment is 5 billion, government spending is 10 billion, and trade is in the balance, with both exports and imports at 10 billion. This gives us an AD of 100 billion. At a lower hypothetical price level, say at 96, AD increases to 115 billion, and at a higher price level, at 104, AD falls to 85 billion. Looking at the relationship between AD and the price level graphically, we see that an AD curve will slope downwards. A fall in the price level, from P to P1, will cause the quantity demanded to increase from Y to Y1. The downward slope of AD is explained in terms of the following effects. Firstly, prices and consumer spending are inversely related via a wealth effect. If we assume households' nominal income is fixed, a change in the price level of all goods will alter what households can purchase when they spend all their nominal income. That is, their real income adjusts inversely with prices. A lower price level means consumers purchase more, and a higher one means they can purchase less. Secondly, the lower price level means households and firms need to keep less of their assets in a liquid form and can deposit excess assets with banks as savings, or purchase stocks and shares, or, in the case of firms, buy bonds. This extra liquidity into the financial system puts downward pressure on interest rates, which can stimulate investment and consumer spending. This is called the interest rate effect. Thirdly, the exchange rate effect indicates that, at a lower price level, interest rates will fall, and overseas demand for a country's assets will also fall, reducing the demand for the currency and its exchange rate. This encourages export sales and discourages imports, creating a positive net export effect. If we now hold the price level constant, these effects are put on hold, and other factors come into play which shift the whole position of the AD curve. Shifts from changes related to consumption include changes in decisions to save, changes in confidence levels and expectations, and changes in the quantity of money or availability of credit. For example, decisions to save more will result in a shift to the left in the AD curve. Shifts from changes in investment can also arise from changes in the money supply, which affect interest rates and business decisions. Shifts also arise from changes in business confidence and expectations. A dip in business confidence will shift the AD curve to the left. Shifts in AD can also arise from decisions by governments to spend more or less, for example, on infrastructure projects or on education and healthcare. Finally, shifts can arise from changes in net exports, such as those caused by changes in exchange rates or a country's competitiveness. The fall in sterling after Brexit gave a short-term boost to UK exports and shifted AD to the right. In terms of aggregate supply, AS, the relationship between it and the price level is more complex and controversial. Historically, classical economists assumed that a country's output was not determined by the price level, which they regarded as a nominal value, because, they argued, nominal values cannot affect real values such as output and employment. Graphically, the AS curve would be vertical. In contrast, Keynesian economists assumed that supply could adjust to demand, and the only factor determining the level of output and employment would be the position of the AD curve, hence the AS curve is horizontal. To solve this dilemma, modern economists differentiate the short-run AS curve, called SRAS, and the long-run AS curve, called LRAS, and also accept that, in the short run, SRAS is upward sloping. The sticky wage theory is the primary explanation of the upward slope of SRAS. Given that nominal wages are slow to adjust in the short run as workers are on fixed contracts, a change in the price level will impact on profits. For example, a rise in the price level will mean that revenue will increase while labor costs remain fixed at the unadjusted nominal level. Hence, profit margins will rise. This provides firms with a short-term opportunity to generate a profit by supplying more. A fall in the price level will reduce revenue relative to inflexible labor costs, and supply will be cut back to avoid losses. Sticky price theory suggests that producer prices for some goods may be slow to adjust to changes in the general price level because there are costs to firms of changing prices, known as menu costs. So, for example, a rise in the general price level, not matched by an immediate rise in some firms' prices, will cause these firms to be more competitive, with an incentive to produce more. A fall in the general price level will make those producers with sticky prices less competitive, and they will cut back on production. Lastly, information failure can also help explain the positive slope of the SRAS curve. Suppliers may, wrongly, take the general price level as an indication of the specific market conditions facing them. For example, if the price level is rising, firms may assume their prices will also rise and increase their production. The extent to which SRAS adjusts to new price levels, that is, the elasticity of short-run supply, will vary considerably from industry to industry and depend upon how close the economy is to its natural rate of output. With no slack in the economy, it is unlikely that output can increase at all, and the SRAS curve becomes vertical. If we hold the price level constant, a change in any other factor associated with supply will shift the SRAS curve. This includes, firstly, expectations about the future price level. For example, if the price level is expected to rise next year, rational producers may expect workers to bid for increases in nominal wages to maintain their same real wage. Also, other input costs will rise as other firms in the supply chain will also increase their prices. This may lead them to plan to produce less this year, and SRAS will shift to the left. SRAS will also shift as a result of changes in the availability of workers and in the level of capital stock. New technology will also affect SRAS, given its effect on production costs. For example, innovation and the use of newer technology will shift SRAS to the right, given that it will increase labor productivity and reduce labor costs. Finally, unexpected changes in supply conditions, called supply shocks, can cause fluctuations in the SRAS curve. For example, a sudden fall in oil or commodity prices will push SRAS to the right. If we look further in the long run, then the quantity and quality of the economy's factors of production are more important in determining output, with the price level becoming largely irrelevant. The level of output in the long run, called the natural rate of output or the level of potential output, can shift following changes in the quantity of factors, such as migration of labor, or the quality of factors, such as education and skill levels. The natural rate of output also depends on cultural factors and the use of technology. What is clear is that a stable price level will reduce distortions in perception and allow decision-making to be more rational, as well as reduce unnecessary and volatile changes in output and employment above or below the stable natural rate. a clear reason why policymakers employ inflation targeting policies.
Macroeconomic gaps, inflation and deflation. We will start by assuming the macroeconomy is in a stable state, with the short-run equilibrium between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply at the full employment level of the economy, shown as YF. Full employment exists when all those who are willing and able to work have paid employment. It does not include people temporarily out of work. A negative demand-side shock can reduce aggregate demand, causing a negative output gap. This could be the result of a fall in a component of aggregate demand, or a fiscal or monetary shock. This is what happened to many global economies following the 2008 financial crash. The classical economists assumed that wages would adjust downwards, given the high level of unemployment. This would cause short-run aggregate supply to increase, and the curve move to the right. Eventually, a new equilibrium would be found. With lower wages and higher output, the economy would move back to YF. However, Keynesian economists recognize that this classical wage adjustment process is weak, and intervention by government or monetary authorities may be required. This would be through expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. Such policies might include lower income tax, rates of interest, or quantitative easing. Aggregate demand will return to a stable, full employment equilibrium. On the other hand, aggregate demand may exceed the economy's capacity to produce, creating a positive output gap. The classical economists believed that the economy would self-adjust through rising wages. This would shift up the short-run aggregate supply curve, causing upward pressure on prices, a contraction in AD, and a reduction in real output, reducing the positive output gap. However, modern economists accept that the economy will not fully self-adjust, and government and authorities must employ tighter fiscal or monetary policy. Positive and negative output gaps can also be looked at by comparing actual output with the trend rate of growth. If demand exceeds the trend, there will be inflationary pressure, and if demand is less than capacity, deflationary pressure will exist. Fiscal and monetary policy can help adjust the macroeconomy, moving it nearer to its stable trend rate.
Now that we know what fiscal policy is, changes in government spending and taxation to achieve particular macroeconomic goals, should we use it? As usual, the answer is, it depends. Perhaps the first question to ask is, can or will the economy correct itself? If you believe that the economy will self-adjust, you would say no to active fiscal policy. Well, what if you don't think the economy will self-adjust? Then should we use fiscal policy? Again, it depends. First, will there be crowding out? By definition, crowding out is the decrease in private expenditures that occurs as a consequence of increased government spending or the financing needs of the deficit. What this means is that in some cases the government uses fiscal policy, let's say, with the intent of giving the economy a boost, and the policy has the unintended consequence of reducing spending by the other sectors like household consumption and/or business investment. This crowding out of the household and business spending can be direct, like building a library and having household purchases of books decline, or like providing government dollars for charter schools and seeing households spend less on private tuition at Catholic schools. Or the crowding out can be the indirect result of the expansionary policy. If the government increases spending and/or decreases taxes, it will increase its own deficit. Then the government needs to borrow in order to pay for the overspending. This added demand pressure for credit drives up the price of credit or interest rates. As interest rates rise, consumption and investment spending fall. The amount of crowding out that occurs, if any, will depend on the type of fiscal stimulus used, since not all types of government spending could replace household and business spending. Time to think. Can you come up with anything that the government spends money on that would not be related to, i.e. not able to replace, private spending? It is possible to see complete crowding out, in which case the government spending is completely offset by reductions in household and investment spending. If this is the case, then in the end, there's no net increase in spending. You might see incomplete crowding out, where the increase in government spending is partially offset by reductions in household and investment spending. If this occurs, there's some net increase in spending, although not as much as the government had intended. The third possibility is that there's no crowding out, i.e. the expansionary fiscal policy will be fully effective. If this is the case, that is, if you do not think that the economy will correct itself and fiscal policy will be fully effective in changing aggregate demand, then should we use it? It depends. There's still one more pitfall to deal with, the question of the timing of the policy. Consider the following. Suppose there's a downturn in the economy. First, how do I know there's been a downturn? Remember, a recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of declining real GDP. This means that somebody out there is gathering real GDP data for you. If the actual downturn started, say, in January, it may take a few months to actually see the trend in the data and realize what's happening, particularly if the data is collected quarterly. This is called the data lag or the observation lag. Second, so your economic analyst comes to you and tells you that real GDP has been declining for the last month or two. What do? Is it going to turn into a recession? Is it just a January effect due to post-holiday declines in spending? If you decide to hold out for the next set of data so that you can tell if it's really a downward trend, then there's now a wait-and-see lag. Third, so you wait and see, and after the next set of data realize there is indeed a downturn in the economy. Now the question is, what to do about it? In a society like ours, the decision must come from our policymakers, so there's a legislative lag as Congress tries to come up with a solution. Fourth, after months of wrangling, the Congress agrees on a plan of action, expansionary fiscal policy, perhaps in the form of increased government spending on new schools. Of course, this requires getting bids for designs and construction, among other things. The transmission lag is the time it takes to actually put the plan into action. Fifth, once construction commences, how long before the money actually makes its way into the economy and has an effect on aggregate demand? The time it takes for the plan to affect the economy once it's been implemented is the effectiveness lag. To see the potential problem inherent in these delays, think back to the business cycle. If the initial downturn is in January, 1. We may not notice the decline until quarterly GDP data is released. 2. Because a downturn isn't a recession until real GDP declines for 2 consecutive quarters, we may choose to wait in order to see if the problem is a trend or if it will self-correct. 3. Once we've determined there really is a problem, the legislature has to come up with and approve a plan of action. 4. Once the plan is approved, it has to be implemented, and once it's implemented, it may be a while before the stimulus takes effect. In this business cycle diagram, you can see that while expansionary policy is fully effective at increasing GDP, given the lags, we end up stimulating an economy that's already expanding, which causes a whole new set of problems, primarily inflation. Time to think. For our next class, I want you to bring your ideas as to how we could minimize each of these time lags, thereby compressing the total time from the emergence of the problem to the impact of the solution on the economy. Next time, taxes and budget.
And what aggregate demand illustrates. Aggregate demand shows the quantity of a nation's output demanded at a range of price levels. In this video, we're going to talk about short-run aggregate supply. Let's start by defining short-run. In microeconomics, you learned that the short run was defined as the fixed plant period. In macroeconomics, however, the definition is slightly different. In macro, we define the short run as the fixed wage period. What do we mean by the fixed wage period? This is the amount of time it takes for the wage rate that workers in a nation are earning to change following a change in some other factor like the price level or the level of total demand for labor or any other factor that might cause wages to change in a country. So wages are fixed in the short run because of things such as labor contracts, minimum wage laws, and worker expectations. In the short run, if firms need to reduce their costs because of a decrease in the price level, they cannot simply lower the wages that they pay the workers that they're employing. Rather than lowering wages, firms must lay workers off, reduce the level of employment, and this is how they will reduce their costs and meet the lower level of demand. We're going to see how this plays out in our graph in just a moment, but first let's move on to our definition of short-run aggregate supply. The short-run aggregate supply in a nation is a curve that illustrates the relationship between the average price level of goods and services in a country and the quantity of total output that businesses will wish to produce in a period of time at a range of price levels. The important part here is that the short-run aggregate supply shows the relationship between the price level in a country and the quantity of output supplied in the short run. In other words, in the fixed wage period. Now this curve, we're going to draw it in just a second, is going to look very familiar if you've already studied microeconomics. In microeconomics, we learned that there was a direct relationship between an individual goods price and the quantity that producers of that good are willing and able to supply in a period of time. Well, unsurprisingly, in macroeconomics, there's also a direct relationship between the average price level in a country, that's PL on my graph, and the quantity of real output, that's real GDP, that firms are willing and able to supply. So our SRAS curve looks a lot like a supply curve in microeconomics. Here we have the direct relationship. As the price level rises in a country, we're going to see that the amount of output that firms are willing and able to supply, indicated by the Y stands for national income, the quantity of output supplied will increase. There is a direct relationship between the average price level of goods and services and the quantity of goods and services produced by a nation's firms. It's basically the law of supply from microeconomics translated to the macro level. So as prices rise, the price level increases, the quantity of output produced increases. So let's talk about why there will be movements along the aggregate supply curve when price level changes. First, let's summarize our observations here. When price level increases, we're going to say when price level increases, this leads to an increase in national output. That's an increase in Y. When price level decreases, when there's deflation, as we call it in macroeconomics, there will be a decrease in the level of output produced in the short run. Why is this the case? The answer has to do with what we call sticky wages. Sticky is just another word for fixed wages. Because wages are sticky, in other words, they're not able to change quickly in responses to changes in the price level, firms have no other option when prices fall than to reduce the amount of output they produce and reduce the number of workers that they employ. Workers sign contracts that guarantee a fixed wage during the period that they're under contract. There are minimum wages. There are unemployment benefits that they could receive from the government if they were to lose their job. For these reasons, firms are not easily able to simply lower wages when the prices of their goods are falling. Therefore, firms must reduce the amount of workers that they employ. At the same time, when prices rise in a country, firms find that workers under contract will continue to get paid the same wage. Therefore, firms are incentivized to increase their output when the price level is rising. They'll continue to pay their workers the same amount, but they'll want to hire more workers and produce more output to take advantage of the higher prices for which they can sell their goods and services. It's just like in microeconomics. When price rises, firms have an incentive to produce more goods because they can earn more profits. When prices fall, firms have an incentive to produce fewer goods and reduce the number of workers that they employ because they can earn less profit at lower price levels. This explains the direct relationship. This is the direct relationship we observe in our short-run aggregate supply curve. In future videos, we'll talk about long-run aggregate supply and alternative views of aggregate supply, which account for what we call the variable wage period, when wages do adjust to the price level in the economy. However, the short-run aggregate supply curve is really easy to understand. It reflects the law of supply from microeconomics. The explanation for why it is upward sloping has to do with the fact that workers' wages do not quickly adjust to the price level in the economy. Therefore, workers will be hired when prices rise in a country and output will increase. When prices fall in a country, workers will be fired and output will decrease. So let's now talk quickly about factors that cause shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve. So we know that rising prices will cause a movement up and to the right along the SRAS curve, and falling prices will cause a movement down and to the left along the SRAS curve. But what can cause a shift in the SRAS curve? Well, this is a lot like microeconomics as well. In micro, we learned that factors that shift a firm's supply curve include anything that affects the firm's costs of production. So in macroeconomics, we can conclude that factors that shift individual firms' supply curves can also shift the aggregate supply curve. This can include factors such as changes in the wage rate. WR for wage rate. If wages fall in a country, firms are going to find it profitable to produce more goods at every price level. So we would expect to see an increase in SRAS to SRAS1. So this would be the result of falling wages. If wages rise in a country, firms would find it less profitable to produce output at every price level, so we would see the SRAS curve shift up or inwards, as we like to say. Of course, wages aren't the only cost that firms face. Other costs that could change and cause a shift in aggregate supply are changes in resource costs. This could include raw materials, energy prices, transportation costs, and so on. A rise in resource prices would cause a decrease in SRAS to SRAS2. A decrease in resource costs would cause an increase in SRAS to SRAS1. Now keep in mind that whenever short-run aggregate supply shifts, what it means is that the quantity of output supplied at each price level would change. So at PL1, for example, a decrease in aggregate supply would result in a decrease in the quantity of real output supplied. At PL1, an increase in short-run aggregate supply would cause an increase in the quantity of output supplied by firms. Firms would find it more profitable at lower resource cost to produce output. They'd find it less profitable at higher cost to produce output. There are some other factors that can shift a country's short-run aggregate supply curve. Government regulation is a big one. An increase in the amount of regulation of the activities of firms in a country would increase costs of production and shift the SRAS curve up or inwards to SRAS2. Reduced government regulation would cause an increase in the quantity of output supplied at every price level, since firms face less red tape, since they face less bureaucracy and are able to produce whatever they want, however they want, in the least cost method. So reduced regulation could potentially increase aggregate supply and increase the amount of output produced at every price level. Another factor involving government is the level of business taxes. Of course, a reduction in business taxes would cause an increase in short-run aggregate supply. An increase in business taxes would cause a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. Taxes are another cost faced by firms. Therefore, lower taxes would cause more output at every price level. A final determinant that could shift the short-run aggregate supply curve is the level of exchange rates in a country. Now, because you're still studying macro, you might not have learned what exchange rates are yet. This is simple. It's basically the price of a country's currency in terms of another currency. So if exchange rates rise, if exchange rates increase, this means that imported resources get cheaper. Cheaper resources, let's say oil imported from another country, could cause short-run aggregate supply to increase. The reverse happens if exchange rates fall. If exchange rates fall, if the country's currency gets weaker compared to other currencies, imported resources will get more expensive and short-run aggregate supply would decrease. Now, if a country only uses domestically produced resources, then of course the exchange rate has no effect on aggregate supply. However, in a global economy, countries depend on resources and raw materials and technology produced all over the world. Therefore, the value of the country's currency could potentially have a significant effect on the level of aggregate supply in the country. All right, in this video, we defined the short run as the fixed wage period. It's the period of time over which the wages that workers get paid is fixed because of labor contracts, because of government interventions such as minimum wages and unemployment benefits. The short run aggregate supply is the level of output produced by a country's firms in the short run. It shows a direct relationship between the average price level of goods and services and the quantity of output supplied. Finally, we talked about the factors that can shift a country's short-run aggregate supply curve, causing the level of output to either increase or decrease at every price level. This includes changes in the wage rate, changes in resource costs, the level of government regulation, the level of business taxation, and the exchange rate in the country, particularly in countries that import a lot of raw